So, how do we achieve dynamic assessment in these targeted areas? When we um, are prompting, because testing the limits is just making sure you are measuring what a child can learn. Prompting would be things like modeling, asking them to imitate things, um, asking them, "What is it?" So, trying to make sure it's part of testing the limits, trying to make sure, we're going to make this assumption that every child can do something. It's just a matter of support they need to do it. So, how much prompting do they need? What kind of prompting do they need to be successful? And then the test, teach, retest would be you do the intervention and you take data, then you reassess it. And is it working or not? If it's working, maybe move on to something else. If it's not, change the intervention. It's just this idea that all goes back to that core thinking of they can do it. What do they need to do it? It's not a matter if they can do it or not. What will they need to be able to do it? Instructional programs, we need to think about now that they have an appropriate assessment. Let's say we're working with them, we need to look at the areas of competence, academic achievement, and social integration. And all three of these are really important. Sorry, my PowerPoint's going a little crazy there. So, what is competence? Now, here is a big area of misunderstanding. So, I want to pause here. What most people think is competent for an English language learner would actually be under this category on the right, a basic interpersonal communication skill set. So maybe that within a couple years of their early or their English language learning intervention, they're able to, speak fluently enough to have positive interpersonal interactions socially and academically. And what happens is then those kids kind of move out of specialized programming. But there is a difference between having a skill and knowing how to use the skill. And that's where this issue arises. So there's this cognitive and academic language proficiency in where they have to use their English skills to learn. It's kind of like when a child learns to read, learns to read, learns to read. And around third or fourth grade, they have to read to learn. That's how they're going to take in a lot of information. A person's ability to take their English skills and apply them, to think about them like metacognitively, metalinguistically, that takes upwards of 5 to 7 years. And we know that kids aren't usually in it that long. And it's not that we even want kids to be in it that long, but there's just a lot of questions there. We have to make sure we're not taking them out too soon. How can we do it? Is there any way to do it to where it doesn't take that long to develop? But we can't just drop them off a cliff. Um, it's just like you as you learn things in this course and your other courses. It's one thing to learn it and pass a test. It's something very different to use it. And it's the same for English language learners. So competence cannot just be measured by their basic interpersonal communication skills, or their life outcome is going to suffer from that. It has to be their cognitive, academic, language proficiency that gives us the competence. Um, then, or going back, sorry, to this slide, we also know, so that should go into academic achievement and social integration. Competence equals all of both of those things. Um, not just how they're doing academically, but how they're doing socially. They should both be considered because social skills are critical for long-term success. But what is working against us as we try and make sure we're assessing them correctly and planning intervention correctly? Some policies, some skewed curriculum, and just a shortage of professionals who share that language and cultural background. The reality is that this bidialectal approach, meaning kind of accepting and treating more than one dialect as standard English, that's not a mandatory approach. And so uh, It gets kind of tricky because it's a good thing to some extent that the federal government wants to leave most of these decisions up to the state, but sometimes you might really disagree with what your state's doing. So, what are some specific instructions for kids that are just struggling with the dialect or just showing a dialectal difference? Um, is I want to go back that video I showed you or you watched of young those young men. That school district was actually sued, remember, for unconsciously indicating Black English is wrong. So even if it's unconsciously, it was wrong. So it's more than just in terms of educational practice and language development. It's really a law issue. I wanted to point out to you I've included a couple resources. One of them that really helps when you're trying to separate dialectal differences or just cultural differences versus a true language disorder is this resource called Talk With Me. And it just kind of gives you examples of what is typical for different dialects and different ethnic groups. And it's so helpful. So you can see, oh, this would be typical for where they're coming from. So I don't have a concern. It's just a wonderful, wonderful material that you can print off for free. So I highly encourage you to do that and keep it as a resource in your classroom. And then considering bidialectal programming, like I was just mentioning, a way that you do that is use both dialectal variants occasionally, avoid, diminutive terms, explicitly teach them, hey, there's more than one way we say the same thing, using resources like Talk With Me to understand their grammatical patterns, to recognize if you should be concerned or not. And then really, why do you do it? You should do it because you're a nice human, but you should do it for their education, for their successful employment. And then, like I said, just ethical and pragmatic reasons. It's just appropriate socially. Now, there's more than the bidialectal approach. We also talk about something called the appreciation approach. And so in the 1960s and 70s, there was this development of actual Black English text. So kind of going the extra step and actually creating things written um, and trying to use it even though it wasn't your natural dialect. But it didn't really work. The thing is that we know there's this concern because dialect speakers who learn English might become less fluent in their native language, and teaching two language might slow their language development. But they really believe that even if we can appreciate it, it still needed to stay separate because it's not possible to encourage a second dialect without discouraging the first one. They think it's better just to do the acceptance and to improve their self-esteem. And then they have this idea that teaching standard English to English language learners is actually a form of political and cultural subjugation. And there was a time when I might not have agreed with that. Anymore, I can see where they could get that notion. I know personally speaking for myself, that would not ever be a reason I would want to help an English language learner, is to conform them. Um, I think the reality is that reading and writing in English for a lot of people around the world has become necessary. Um, so there's this idea that we can appreciate it, but we shouldn't actually try and teach it. I don't know, not acknowledge it, but just very different from the bidialectal approach where we're openly talking about it. Instruction for English language learners. There's a lot of good information in your text. You need to go through these approaches, definitely highlight them and come back to them. A structured immersion, then I think a lot of people um, know about ESL pullout programs. I remember seeing kids go back into the back of the library and do this in, middle school. The sink or swim approach, transitional bilingual education, two-way bilingual education, and bilingual maintenance programs. So there is definitely a lot more than just this ESL pullout. And I didn't really realize until I studied that more. So definitely look in your text at what those might be. But then overall, just suggested strategies as you're teaching. Make sure you're using explicit, direct instruction and being highly interactive. Provide opportunities for them to authentically communicate. So, meaning not in a way that they think you'll accept, but really how they communicate. Provide daily or oral English language instruction that targets language acquisition. So, just like you're doing for all your other kids, helping in their language development. Be conscious that they need to learn expressive and receptive language skills. You can kind of group them by proficiency level. Read more about that in your text and emphasize the acquisition of academic language as well as conversational language. Guys, it's chapter 16. I'm pretty sure I have found a way to make sure you understand the importance of them using their language not only for academics, but socially. That conversational language, that pragmatic piece, that is what people need, and that is what is not often explicitly taught. So make sure, yeah, they're getting what they need to pass that test, but also to have a successful, healthy relationship when they're an adult and, manage their job and their coworkers and all those things that they need. You can teach them all the academia in the world. If they can't use it, it can't be socially appropriate, it's not going to get them very far. Last on this is they gave you some specific things to consider when we're talking about teaching literacy. Uh, there, I would encourage you to take the time to go to the right, look at this list, and try and automatically think, or not automatically, try and systematically go through the list and think, what is something I could do to make sure I use this strategy? Because I'm telling you, it's going to be so much easier to apply when you go in and set up your classroom and your kind of your own library of resources if you already have the stuff thought out and it's just a matter of doing it, because it can be really overwhelming. So you're already going to sit down and think, how am I going to create this a literacy classroom environment, which we talk about all the time? How am I going to encourage collaborative learning? How am I going to use oral and written personal narratives? um, Now, I would suggest using your book too, because it gave you a lot of literature to support what this is talking about, and evidence-based practices that would go with these suggestions. But it will be well worth your time down the road if you keep ideas and resources like this handy as you actually start to teach. All right. The last thing I want you to do is I want you to do this activity, and I've linked it in this learning module too. But it's essentially a poverty simulation, and where they give you a certain amount of money and ask you questions, and you have to see if you can get through the end of the month with some of the issues you're facing, whether it's your car breaking down, your children need to go to a birthday party, your work unionizing, etc., etc. And here's the point I'm trying to drive home, because that's really the last thing you'll do for this unit. I think that it's incredibly valuable that you are very cognizant of the reasons that different kids and different families operate how they do in your building. I'm not talking about extreme cases of abuse or neglect, but just maybe this thing that happens where we kind of start judging, maybe even unconsciously, like, oh, I can't believe their parent missed parent teacher conferences again, or I can't believe they didn't come with whatever snack I asked them to. I think it's just so important for all kids, and again, especially when we're talking about these kids in special education, we really consider why their families are making the choices they're making, and we wanna try and give people the benefit of the doubt as to that they're doing the best